Okay, so today the topic of my talk is climate change, science, technology, policy and politics. And this is essentially a talk about decarbonization. Humanity finds itself at crossroads today with the specter of global warming and climate change accelerating at a pace that has not happened in our recent history. What are the kind of policies and actions that people who are concerned about climate should adopt so that we can avert the kind of risks that we are getting exposed to due to climate change? I want to begin with a brief survey. And I put two questions here, two positions here. The first one states, world leaders are not taking climate change seriously. People are getting affected everywhere. The global economy needs to decarbonize by 2050 or even before it to ensure that warming remains below 1.5 degrees centigrade. The second position is, there is growing climate alarmism in the world. Alarmists are trying to force their agenda on everyone. Decarbonization will happen in an evolutionary way. Humanity has endured much greater challenges in the past and will overcome this too. I'd love to understand, when you look at these two positions and I force you to take one, who would take the position A? If you could raise your hands. Wonderful, thank you. And who would take the position B? You have to take one position. Okay, nobody. All right. Interestingly, position A was taken by Greta Thunberg at the recently concluded World Economic Forum at Davos. And position 2 was taken by, guess who? President Trump. Okay. But this is also a position that I find most of my colleagues take. So it is not, this is probably a majority and dominant position. This is not a minority position. In a very concerned and sensitive community like ours, position A is more prevalent. But in general, people feel that there is, while they are concerned about climate change, people feel that, there is a lot of alarmism in the discourse. So I just want to start with doing a quick recap of a couple of basic facts about global warming and climate change. This is not a talk about effects of climate change. I think we're already exposed to a lot of information in the media. There is daily news about, what's happening in terms of wildfires, floods, rise of ocean levels, Arctic melting, ice sheets melting away, and so I think we are exposed to a lot of it and we understand a lot of it. But as I started digging deeper into this topic, I realized that there is very little consensus on what needs to be done and how do we move forward from here. So this is really, I want to start with, just recapping a couple of facts about climate change, and then I'll move into policy issues. So if you look at the rise of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 30 years, it's been a relentless march. Greenhouse gases are rising at a little over 1.5% a year. While carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas, methane and nitrous oxide are also pretty significant. People say that this is like, the most unprecedented rise of greenhouse gases in such a short period of time. And at this rate, greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere would double in 100 years. This is like, I think, unprecedented in the last 3 or 4 million years of Earth's history. And what this leads to is basically global warming. Now this graph shows average Earth's temperature starting from 1850s to now. And relative to 1850s, Earth's temperature has already risen by 1.1 degrees C. Now this may not sound like much, but it's a lot. And it's continuing to rise at around 0.2 degrees C per decade. And we expect that we would hit 2 degrees centigrade in another 4 decades. Now 2 degrees centigrade is a kind of magic number that has been the basis of Paris Agreement. That is something that climate scientists warn us about. Because there is a general concern if Earth's temperatures rise above 2 degrees centigrade relative to 1850s, we would not only have a pretty serious impact both in terms of human cost and the cost of mitigation the effects of climate change, but there is something more sinister that can happen, which is there could be potentially the risk. I'm not saying this has to happen, and I want to stay away from an alarmist position here, but the risk for self-sustaining release of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases from carbon sinks on the earth can take over climate change, and we may get into a trajectory where temperatures rise on their own even if we don't emit any carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. Those risks go up. Climate models try and predict those risks, but climate models are not precise science. But they can predict how the risks go up, and so 2 degrees centigrade is a kind of golden number that climate scientists say we should not try and exceed. And we are going to hit that at current rates of emissions. We're going to hit that in another 4 decades. So if I forecast based on existing policies how our emissions are going to shape up, the red graph here is an optimistic forecast of how we would, starting from roughly 57 gigatons a year of emissions in 2019, how emissions would shape up over the next 3 decades. And this assumes that Europe decarbonizes completely, China starts decarbonizing in another decade, that's their express commitment, their policy commitment, and India starts decarbonizing right after that. And even then, the carbon emissions based on current policies would continue to rise till mid-2030s and slowly decline after that. A 1.5 degree scenario requires us to cut down greenhouse gas emissions from now to zero over the next 30 years. And this is what climate scientists and UN considers the emissions gap. There's a big gap between what is happening and what needs to be done. So much of my talk is really about how do we address this gap, what are the current policies, what needs to be done, and what are the challenges in implementing those policies. Now, a gap like this requires a very significant change in policies. This cannot be done incrementally. You cannot go from increasing emissions to linearly decreasing emissions without a very significant turn in the way we do things. If you look at the current policies that we have to address decarbonization and climate change, many of those policies were formulated around 15 or 20 years back after the implementation of Kyoto Protocol in 2005. If you go back 15 years and talk about how the world should decarbonize, Remember, there was no solar and wind at that time, or even if they were there, they were very expensive solutions. So if you go back and look at how the current policy framework was formulated, it was formulated on 4 legs. The first one was energy efficiency. And this has been a very effective policy tool for the last 2 or 3 decades. We set standards for reducing or increasing miles per gallon of vehicles. We set standards for improving building efficiency. We improved industrial efficiencies. The second policy leg was transition to lower carbon fuels. In US, especially after the shale gas revolution, and not everyone agrees with shale gas, but what shale gas did is it transitioned the power sector in US from coal to natural gas, which led to a significant decline in carbon emissions in the US power sector. Another policy leg of lower carbon fuels is biofuels. The third policy leg was carbon pricing and offsets. And there were programs like cap and trade and carbon tax that were introduced in various parts of the world. The intent of carbon pricing was to basically act as a deterrent for industries, sectors, companies that are blatant sort of carbon emitters. And the last policy, which was introduced around a couple of decades back, starting with Germany, and was adopted in China, US, India, rest of Europe, is incentives and mandates for wind, solar, and electric vehicle. And this has been very effective. If you look at the growth of solar, wind, and now electric vehicles, it is expected that in another decade or so, wind and solar would be the cheapest sources of electricity, even relative to coal in China and Southeast Asia, where coal is really cheap, in another decade. Electric vehicles would be at par with internal combustion engine-based vehicles in another decade. We've seen almost 60 to 80% cost declines in solar power, in battery packs for electric vehicles. And we have seen almost 35 to 50% cost declines in wind power. But are these policies adequate going forward? Because this is the framework that is giving us 1.5% increase per year. This framework is not, with all these policies, we are still getting 1.5% growth in greenhouse emissions per year. Primarily because the growth of economy in the developing world is much faster than reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. So how do we move forward from here? What do we do? I just want to be mindful of time. Okay, I have enough time here. So if you look at really what's been made possible by the growth of renewables, is that in energy, we are seeing a transition from the age of fossils to the age of renewables. So that's very clear now, that the age of fossils will end at some point in time. Normally, energy transitions occur over a period of a century and a half. They don't happen in 10 or 20 years. And it's very clear that we'll see a transition from age of fossils to age of renewables. Let's just recap what the fossil industry is based on. There are 3 primary fuels. Coal, natural gas, petroleum. A liquid, a solid, and a gas, interestingly. They are mined, extracted around the world, and then shipped and transported to the point of use. And there they are converted into thermal energy and eventually into useful work. Now, this is a very literate forum. Heat is thermodynamically the highest entropy source of energy. So these are very inefficient processes. In the age of renewables, we'll again have a trio. And that trio is wind, solar, and energy storage. Like coal, natural gas, and petroleum, these are also complementary sources of complementary technologies. They complement each another. These resources are freely available. Wind is freely available. Solar is freely available. It is transported electrically. There is no more physical transport of energy resources. They are transported through electrons, through the electric grid. And then we use electricity to do useful work. We use electric motors, we use LED lighting. We don't have internal combustion engines. We don't have steam turbines, and we don't have jets. So this transition is what policies need to accelerate. This possibility was not available to us a decade and a half back. A decade and a half back, the age of renewables was at best nebulous. It wasn't very clear if this would happen. It wasn't very clear, So what kind of policies do we need to implement to accelerate transition from fossils as a primary source of energy to renewables as a primary source of energy? So the first thing we need to do is we need to accelerate the transition, make it more expensive to continue for the fossil industry to continue to operate. Now IMF published a study last year where they tried to calculate what's the social cost of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are happening in the world. And they basically looked at two elements. One is the pollution that greenhouse gases cause from Delhi to Beijing and in all the major cities of the world, in Asia and possibly Africa. And secondly, what's the cost of mitigation of all the climate change that's been caused by fossil fuels? And they estimated that the social cost of fossil fuels, which is not borne by the fossil industry, is around $6 trillion every year. Now, $6 trillion is more than the total revenue fossil industry generates every year by a factor of 1.5. The total revenue of fossil industry is around $3 to $4 trillion annually. The amount of cost that it is passing on and not getting penalized for that is 1.5 times their total revenue. So there is a very strong ethical, moral case, and there is a very strong economic case for extending carbon pricing. The present regime of carbon pricing covers only 20% of global emissions. And the actual price of carbon dioxide, which is calculated in dollars per ton, is too low to even be a deterrent. Now, policy experts believe that the target carbon dioxide price needs to be increased from roughly $5 to $7 a ton in 20% of total emissions to around $60 to $100 a ton for the entire emissions. You may have read that the recently concluded climate meet in, I think, Madrid could not reach a consensus because the players could not agree to a COP25. Players could not agree to a common mechanism for pricing carbon and also ensuring mechanisms so that offsets could be, allowances could be priced across national borders. But this is if there is one policy that can speed up the transition from age of renewables to age of fossils, it's carbon pricing. Carbon pricing has to include not only a reason, it needs to be a global carbon pricing with reasonable prices for carbon, but it also needs to include heavy penalties for fugitive natural gas emissions and gas flaring. Now, methane emissions from gas pipelines is a very serious issue and the industry hides it. The second policy that we need to adopt is we need to move away from a framework of energy efficiency. Because if you make fossil consumption more efficient, you don't get away from fossil consumption. You only reduce your fossil consumption. We need to move away from fossil consumption. So the policy focus needs to move away from energy efficiency and fuel mixes to one, rapidly decarbonizing electric grids and then promoting electrification. We need to incentivize to be able to rapidly decarbonizing electric grids. We need to incentivize long duration storage, because wind and solar, even though they are cheap and great, they are intermittent. You don't control how much solar flows through a solar plant. You don't control how much wind energy is created by a wind plant. These are intermittent. They need to be complemented with energy storage. So long duration energy storage needs to be incentivized. We need to accelerate and create incentives for electrifying heating. If you look at our homes, space heating is done by natural gas. So is water heating. And so is cooking in most of the homes. Same holds true for commercial and industrial heating applications. So we need to incentivize electric heating. And we need to incentivize light and heavy duty transportation. Now that's happening. It's happening in especially light duty transportation. But there need to be more incentives. And the last policy measure that needs to be considered is we need to broaden the incentives and mandates to include technologies that address tough to decarbonize sectors. And these sectors add up to 40% worldwide, so they are not small. They are numerically pretty large. And this includes aviation. You can put batteries in a truck and a car, but you can't put batteries in a plane. They're just too heavy. So there are other solutions here which are low carbon or zero carbon that need to be considered. Agriculture. Agriculture is globally a source of 13% greenhouse gas emissions. This includes methane from rice fields, nitrous oxide from the fertilizers we use, and also livestock and meats that we consume. There is 3 times more land, agricultural land, that goes towards farming for grains for livestock and grasslands versus for human consumption. There is more land towards livestock today than the total amount of global forests in the world. So all these are factors that need to be considered. Steel and cement. Now, steel and cement are not growing industries in advanced economies, because we have pretty much built our infrastructure. But these are massive industries in China, India, and rest of the developing world, because they are still in the process of building infrastructure. And steel and cement by themselves, steel because it uses coke for blast furnaces to reduce iron ore into iron, and cement because we use limestone to make cement. So both limestone and coke that is used in blast furnaces add up to a huge significant factor of global greenhouse gas emissions, close to 10%. And these are tough to decarbonize sectors. So, and there are additional technologies that are being tried for the last experiments, pilots, or even mature technologies in each of these sectors which are non-carbon based. So we need to have policies to go beyond wind, solar and electric vehicles to address all these sectors that are tough to decarbonize sectors. And in sectors where we can't decarbonize, we just don't know how to do it right now. We need to implement carbon capture. We need to implement carbon capture to capture the carbon dioxide and sequester it and store it in underground storage. Maybe in oil wells or wherever. And all these technologies are at an early stage, and they need to have the same level of incentives and mandates that we've had for solar, wind and electric vehicles, battery packs. And another decade and a half, 2 decades of incentives and mandates can accelerate and scale up these technologies on a rapid scale. So what are the challenges? Why is this not happening? It seems innocuous enough, it's very clear. Why is it not happening? Why are countries not jumping into saying, hey, this is a serious problem, needs to be addressed, there are clear technologies, policies, we've had successes in the past, why don't we just go ahead and do it? And here is a list of some challenges. There is a complete lack of timeline and strategy for full decarbonization of major emitting nations. At this point, only Western Europe has a clear timeline and strategy for decarbonization. They are committed to it. And the reason they are committed to it is there is environmental consciousness and pressure from below to go and decarbonize. In countries like US, Russia, or countries in Middle East, the economies are so hydrocarbon based. US is the largest producer of hydrocarbons in the world today, followed closely by Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's not in their interest, and the lobbies are too strong to advocate decarbonization. There is so much economic goods that are being produced by the carbon industry. And then countries like China, India, and countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, they are prioritizing development over decarbonization. They're saying we have scarce capital resources. We'd rather put food on the table now than worry about what happens 3 or 4 decades from now. So there's a lack of timeline. There is uneven developmental stages of nations, which is something I partly covered in my previous point. Countries in Africa, I called up my colleague in Myanmar recently and talked to him about climate change in Myanmar. And he says, people are worried about putting food on the table here. Climate change is not even a consideration. Now, on the other hand, if you are a country like Maldives, which are basically islands in Indian Ocean, you'd be very worried because another half a meter of sea level rise could just, so countries are at different uneven development stages and they are at different levels of susceptibility to climate change. Then there is ability of fossil industry to influence climate agenda. I think this is a huge issue. I work in the renewable sector and I see every day that fossil industry is buying up all the renewable companies around the world. They will start owning up all the renewable companies. So another 5 years from now, they will decide the pace of decarbonization because they will own all the traditional carbon-based energy companies or resources and they will also own all the renewable companies. And this is a big problem. I mean, if fossil industry starts owning up the renewable sector, they not only have traditional channels of lobbying and influencing the climate agenda, they would actually have direct levers to control the climate agenda. Then there is carbon pricing. A high carbon pricing is inflationary. We saw in France, Yellow Vest was basically a small increase in carbon tax on petrol or petrol as they would call it there, led to a serious social movement in France. Because it affects, any carbon tax is a regressive tax. It's not the poor pay more than the rich. So carbon pricing is inflationary. Livelihood of fossil workers. Trump was able to convince a lot of working class in the coal belts that he's for them, and the Democrats or whoever are against them. And then if we are able to transition rapidly from fossil-based energy sources to renewables, there will be stranded fossil assets. All these coal plants, all the cars we own, let's say we transition to electric vehicles, a life of a car is 20 years. If we buy a fossil-based car, it's going to last for 20 years. You set up a coal plant, it's going to last for 30 to 40 years. So there's strong financial interest in preventing this, because if rapid transition happens, it's very disruptive for the financial industry. So these are some of the policy challenges. While the path is clear as to what needs to be done, there are serious policy challenges in implementing it. So what strategies do we adopt, and how do we go beyond these policy challenges? At the heart, the issue is we know what technologies need to be scaled up, and we've seen from our experience in the last 15 years that if we scale up these technologies which are not greenhouse gas based, we can rapidly reduce their cost and make them economically viable. If we can get a few advanced economies to take a lead in full decarbonization, we can create competitive solutions that then backward economies will emulate. And it will not be a choice between development and decarbonization. In fact, development will happen through decarbonization. So I said Europe is already committed here, and they are in the process. EU is in the process of legislating a net zero policy by 2050. UK is already a national policy of net zero by 2045. And California is a huge economy, and California is another place where we can get long-term decarbonization policies adopted. New York is another state which is very progressive in terms of, if we can have a few major economies, and if we can flip a few major economies to agree to decarbonization, it creates enough momentum for the rest of the world to follow. And another option is climate movement in India, China, US, forces politicians to formulate timelines and policies for complete decarbonization. It is possible that UN negotiators succeed in creating a global framework for carbon pricing and for greenhouse gas reduction. That's another place where advocacy and climate movement needs to focus on as UN negotiations. Popular demand and shared risk perception can lead corporations to decarbonize independent of national policies. We already know that corporations like Walmart, Microsoft, Amazon, these are huge emitters, have now explicit policies and timelines for decarbonization. And there is a movement among global fund managers, pension funds and large funds, including BlackRock, where they have explicitly sort of started to defund major carbon emitters. They would not invest there, they would not loan money to them. Now, this could be another policy tool for and another strategy for climate movement. And lastly, even in countries where there is no national policy, we can still influence city, county, or state level policies to set up timelines for decarbonization. So these are potential strategies that we could adopt, because it's very clear that even if a few countries take a lead in decarbonization and scale up alternative technologies, the rest will follow. I want to finish in half an hour so that we can have a discussion. I'd love to hear your comments, so I'm going to summarize. I do have a few other policy slides and slides on California's policies on decarbonization, but I'll hold them back for now. And so let's just summarize. Existing climate policies are not effective in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C or even 2 degrees C, and they are not effective in closing the emissions gap. 60 nations, primarily smaller developing countries and Europe, whoever represent 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, are in the process of legislating zero emissions by 2050. A suite of new technologies need to be scaled up besides wind, solar, and electric vehicles to achieve full decarbonization. There is a distinct possibility that warming of 2 degrees centigrade will happen by 2060. It may happen faster, we don't know that. And I don't want to be alarmist here, but the risks go up, the cost of mitigation goes up. It's best that we avoid that regime, that zone of risk. And lastly, the global climate movement needs to adopt a multi-pronged strategy to combat warming. I'm going to end here and invite comments and questions from you, and then, based on time, I can go on to a few more slides.
You had any knowledge of how bad methane leaks are from natural gas wells?
So there is a statistic that the emissions and energy used by the fossil fuel industry amount to 10% of global emissions, global greenhouse emissions. And I think that between gas flaring and fugitive emissions, the number is around 4 to 5% of global greenhouse emissions, in that range.
I forgot my wallet.
Thank you. What do you think about microgrids? Are they practical, specifically in our area, technically and from political standpoint? And is your company involved in some projects of this nature? If
I may just ask you, what is you said mic?
Sorry.
I could not understand.
Microgrids. So the grids based on local storage and renewable.
Bricks, okay.
Yeah. So there is a big interest now, probably related to this PG&E, energy blackouts and.
Sure. I think there is so first of all, my company is involved in solar inverters and power electronics for EV charging. So we're not an energy storage company. My company is involved in power electronics that is needed to convert these resources and interface with the electric grid. I think there is a very large suite of technologies which are potential candidates for energy storage. For short duration energy storage, there is lithium ion itself. As the automotive industry is scaling, lithium ion is getting cheaper and cheaper, and for 2 to 4 hour storage, lithium ion is at this point the best candidate. For storage beyond from 4 to 8 and 10 hours, redox flow batteries, or what flow batteries, which are in terms of cost and maturity right behind lithium ion, is a very strong candidate. Then concentrating solar power is another source of energy storage. And then you have, pumped hydro, compressed air, and the technology you talked about where you basically convert electricity into heat and then back to electricity. These are all potential options, including hydrogen. Electrolyze water, create hydrogen, and then basically use fuel cells to convert hydrogen back into electricity. These are all potential candidates for long-term storage. So the suite of technologies for energy storage is very large. However, given the nature of policies, at this point long duration energy storage is not incentivized. We don't need long duration energy storage if the penetration of renewables in the grid is just 10 to 20%. And so I think this is an issue that will become more serious, especially in California, as we move from roughly 30% penetration of renewables in the grid now to 60% penetration by the end of this decade.
I'd like to bring up a couple of points. First off, all of our problems are due to too many of us. We are exceeded only by ants and termites. That is the root of every problem. Now, if everybody had an electric vehicle, there's no way you could provide enough energy from solar and wind, period. The solution is a molten salt thorium reactor. These operate at atmospheric pressure, no problem with high pressure. They do not require cooling water. They could be located anywhere on the planet. Secondly, they can reuse spent fuel from boiling water and pressurized water reactors, period. And furthermore, thorium is 4 times available in nature than uranium. How come nobody mentions these reactors, which would actually solve the energy problem? Thank you. God has spoken.
Totally. So I'll answer your question here, which is how come nobody has seen.
I don't know why everybody's afraid of reactors.
People are afraid of reactors after Chernobyl. So that's the truth. So there are two reasons here. By the way, I knew a lot about thorium reactors because India is very big on thorium reactors. And they have one of the few sort of experimental thorium reactors in the world. See, the issue is, there are 2 issues with nuclear power, and I'm not against nuclear power. I'm for safe nuclear power. One is that at this point, nuclear power, once it's made safe, is around 4 to 5 times more expensive than wind and solar. And there is enough wind and solar, sir. There is enough wind and solar to power not only the 7 billion humans we have on Earth, but much more than this.
The Chinese are developing this reactor. They may eventually sell them to us.
Possibly. I would love to have safe thorium reactors. I think that technology is not mature as yet.
Could you go back to the potential strategies slide? So there are quite a few of these things that are already happening. There's certainly the United Nations negotiations been going on for 25 years. I'm not happy with how much progress they've made, but they are making some. And popular demand and shared risk perception. It's not just BlackRock.
Uh-huh.
The Rockefeller family that made its money off of Standard Oil, decided to divest?
Decarbonize.
Yeah. Local policies, there's a lot of that stuff going on around the country, and I assume around the world. And I think that, there is a growing climate movement. I've been interested in it for about 20 years, and first 5 years or so, there was hardly anything, but I've been watching it grow for the last 15 years. So I guess that's it.
Great. So I guess your question is, these things have been happening. Will they really make a change? Right.
Yeah,
That skepticism, is in terms of
not future.
not future, and they are happening clearly. But as climate awareness is growing, and as the fear of potential risks of climate change are taking root across the world, I find that there is renewed momentum in all these strategies. When I look at what's happening in the corporate world in US today, I see almost every corporate leader, besides Exxon, Chevron, BP, if you leave them aside, are talking about decarbonization timelines. So there is a growing awareness because of increased risk perception.
First I wish to thank you for a very clear presentation. But I would like to ask a question. When you had this plot of the increase in temperature versus time, going up to 1.5 or 2 degrees and so on. That was
this one.
In plotting that curve, we make some assumption. And one assumption is that things more or less continue as they are now. But we know, and I would like to have your comments, that there is the possibility that we encounter some tipping points. And one example is what is happening to the ocean. Not only the temperature is going up, but the oxygen content is going down in many, many areas. And what is happening in Greenland in another place could generate a change in the ocean currents, both in the Pacific, and that would lead to a very different curve, because we could have spikes in what is happening, and that would have...
You could have a self-sustaining rise in...
Yes. I mean, it's a complex system, a lot of feedbacks, and I mean, we are doing this great experiment. In fact, we are doing
in real
it
time.
now,
In real time.
whether we like it or
Sure.
not.
Sure.
And what is really going to happen is there is a lot of uncertainty. It might be much worse than that.
No, I absolutely agree. There are risks here. Based on my research, the first tipping point is coral reefs around the world. I think we can just assume that they will be destroyed more or less in the next couple of decades. The next tipping point is, the next more significant tipping point is permafrost melting of permafrost and release of carbon sinks, or all the captured carbon in the permafrost regions of the world. When you look at some of these feedback factors, the problem is that these feedback factors are also highly nonlinear. You can't predict them. You assume based on certain values now, but as you are saying, we are doing a real-time experiment here, and we are playing with fire. So clearly, but my reading is that those based on whatever we know, those factors don't kick in a big way till 2 degrees centigrade. They start kicking it beyond it. But you're right. Nobody can predict what shape this curve would take.
Question about, you made a statement that we've only been using wind and solar for the past 10 or 15 years. In 1982, we had solar units at Carrizo Plains. In 1978, we had wind turbines at Altamont Pass. Where's the discrepancy here?
No, so what I claimed is that these technologies started scaling up for the last decade and a half. They've been around for much longer. I worked on solar in the 80s. So and at that point I thought I should become a solar scientist. I didn't eventually. It took me much later to get into this field. And wind is an even more mature technology. It's been around for even longer than solar. The wind's been around for roughly 1,000 years, if you want to just claim. But these technologies started scaling up in the last 15 years, and they got into this virtuous spiral of scaling up, innovation, invention, economies of scale, lower cost, scaling up, innovation, invention, lower cost. That is what happened when incentives came into play after the Kyoto Protocol. But they've been around for a very long time, Absolutely agreed, sir.
One thing that I've not heard much about here is biodiversity. It seems that as it gets warmer and many species can no longer live in the conditions that we give them when there's the salt water and goes away, the fresh water overcomes, the different species can no longer survive. And we are, well, as far as a tipping point, is there going to be one of those too, as far as when the number of different species of fish goes down, and then, well, the people who are surviving on fish now have to figure out something else to eat, and things like that. That's one of the aspects that I haven't really heard about.
Sure, and that's a great point. It's clear that this rapid climate change is a catastrophe as far as biodiversity is concerned. And the normal response of species to a warming Earth is that they move upward in altitude and northwards in latitude. Or if you are in the southern hemisphere, you move southward in latitude. But the climate change is happening at such a rapid scale, relative to geological time scales, that this species migration is not happening, and there is loss of genetic diversity. Now, I haven't come across literature as to how this loss of genetic diversity would impact human, let's say, agriculture or the entire ecosystem of food. But I would suspect there is some impact. There should be at some point. Human beings have evolved, co-evolved. We are a part of nature. We are different from nature, and we have evolved in a certain pool of genetic diversity. And if you destroy that pool of genetic diversity, then humans don't stand in isolation alone. At some point this would be catastrophic for human beings. But I don't know if there's any quantification of that. And my suspicion is that if you look at geological history of Earth has been 5 to 7 degrees colder, and Earth has been 7 to 8 degrees warmer. So there has been a very wide fluctuation in Earth's temperature when seen over millions and billions of years. And oceans have been 100 meters shallower, and oceans have been 100 meters higher. Okay, so there has been, so if you look at history of Earth has gone through pretty significant changes in Earth's climate. There are fossils found in Greenland and northern parts of, which are tropical fossils. Earth was tropical even in Greenland and Arctic regions at some point in its history. And we have had ice sheets right up to north of where we live. So Earth's history has gone through pretty serious changes in terms of its climate, and it has survived that, and life has survived those changes. So I sort of think that yes, it may be bad for humans and our lifestyle, but I don't think that we'll necessarily be able to destroy life on Earth by what we do.
Hi, just a clarification on terminology. You used the term full decarbonization. Is that the same as zero emissions?
I've kind of struggled a little bit with terminology here. Because what matters is all greenhouse gas emissions. and that includes methane, which is a carbon source. So you could say, hey, that's included in the carbon bucket. And then there is nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases, which are very long-lived greenhouse gases.
But is the point to reach, to
Zero.
stop emitting all of these, right?
Point, not only that, the point is at some point, I hope as human societies evolve, we can actually be able to control the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which means we could go negative or positive.
Well, part two of the question is, what about carbon sequestration and reducing carbon? Any efforts there?
So carbon sequestration is a technology that's being promoted heavily by the oil industry. Just so that I just want to create a context here, because they see that as a virtuous cycle where they sequester carbon in the oil wells and then pump more oil in the process at a cheaper price. So, but I think it's a very serious. Carbon sequestration is an important policy tool and an important technology, and it can have two roles here. One is when you look at industries like cement and steel, where we don't really have clear solutions for green steel and green cement. Now there are some pilots of using hydrogen to reduce iron ore instead of coke. And I think that's a direction forward for steel. But these industries would have to capture and sequester carbon. It is roughly estimated that the cost of capturing and sequestering carbon is around $100 a ton carbon dioxide right now at current scale of technology. And that is why policy experts say, hey, carbon pricing should get to $100, because at that point this becomes a wash and neutral. Did that address your? Okay, great.
I have an idea, I want to see the two sides. There is no antagonism between one side and the other. So what we have to do is to create one way where we all pass through it. We know climate change existed in nature. As we said, we are the product of nature. So here you have to consider the culture and the understanding of the other side, and the culture and the understanding of the other side. And they are both controlled by people who are controlling the economy here and there. And eventually what happened, both sides will reduce the resources of the earth, and eventually we all go together in the same ditch. And Mother Nature will tell you, I cannot give you anything else.
Could I just ask you a clarifying question? When you say two sides,
The anti-climate change and those with the climate change, because they're coming here forcing on those people who don't understand what's going on scientifically. In a scientific terminology, or I'm forcing you to do what I want to do, but this one wants to live too.
Sure. The climate change affects everyone, irrespective of whether you're anti-climate change or pro-climate change. It's secular. It's not a. However, one has to just, I looked at a recent survey that was done on climate change, and in US more than 50% believe climate change is real and something needs to be done. And only 15% of people believed were climate deniers.
So what we have to do is to have public meeting on TV, on real, physical meeting together, and let each other understand what the other one is saying.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Only speak into the mic.
I know, I completely agree. And there has to be more outreach. There has to be more advocacy, and frankly, I feel that 50% people is pretty large. If you have 50% people who believe something needs to be done, 35% people are skeptical and 15 are deniers. That battle of public opinion has already been won. What's happening now is basically economic interests that are rooted in the fossil fuel industry are able to influence climate action. And again, policymakers in third world countries and developing countries are prioritizing cheaper fossil technologies over more expensive renewable options. That is a battle that needs to be won.
Hi there. I just want to point out that I too have been a solar proponent activist since the 70s, before the 80s, and I still have a bunch of my Solar Age magazines from the period. My question has to do with passive solar, which was not talked about, and associated with that mass storage. Now, I built a house in Vermont maximizing the south-facing roof angles for the latitude for maximum absorption of heat. I also built a large sun space with potential for mass storage. In the winter, it could be 10 degrees below zero. The house would be completely warm, no heat needed, and it would last into the night. Okay, that's not 100% of need, but it's a significant contributor. So what are your thoughts about passive solar and mass storage?
No, I think both these are important technologies. I used to work in a company that had a product that had a combination of active, what you would call active solar or photovoltaic solar, with. So if you put modules on your rooftop, the area under the modules is very hot, and you can use that heat. So this company had a product where it had a hybrid photovoltaic thermal product, where the thermal aspect was used for both space heating and water heating. So I think these are important solutions, but what we found out in the market is that it was cheaper to just generate photovoltaic energy and use that to heat up places. It was cheaper versus trying to use a combination hybrid of solar and thermal. But I think using solar for direct heating, using solar to heat molten salt towers and then use them as energy storage to be used later, are very important technologies. And as emphasis changes from just raw solar and raw wind, if I may use that term, which is without storage, to having long duration storage, then having concentrating solar which heats up molten salt towers and then stores energy, I think is going to be a very, very important technology in the next 10-15 years. That's my personal view.
Okay, Carl's going to give a presentation on our finances shortly, so this will be the last question.
You made the statement that we've had these climate changes over the millennia. So how do you respond to the naysayers who say, this is just normal flow?
This is a very, involved question. And this is what naysayers do, is they use that data to, I'm going to just, do I have like 2 or 3 minutes to do that, or,
A minute or so, yeah.
Okay. Now this is a graph that tries to represent climate changes over millennia. Sorry. Can you see my, no. I'm trying to get the laser pointer here. Now the Earth is somewhere here right now. The x-axis shows sea level and y-axis shows temperature. Earth has experienced anything from 5 degrees below where we are, 5 to 7 degrees, to 5 to 7 degrees above where we are, if you look at millennia in the past. And Earth has seen roughly 130 meters lower sea levels, and it has seen 70 meters higher sea levels. No question about that. I mean, we are in an ice age today where the Earth kind of limits cycles. And we are actually in an interglacial period of an ice age. And this period is called the Holocene by geologists. Human civilization has arisen in this very nice, stable temperature for the last 10,000 years. In this range. This is not the norm. The norm is we are either here or we are here. This is not the norm. But this is the norm for human civilization. This is what humanity has grown from settled agriculture and nomadic period to where we are today. And all our food systems and industrial systems have arisen in very stable temperatures of roughly where we are today. It's a metastable state. It's not a stable state. And we can easily slip into either of these two. There are risk factors in either direction. And that is why I believe humanity in long term has to develop the technologies needed to stay in this metastable state. This is not just a short-term issue. 10,000 years from now, 50,000 years from now, we would be controlling temperature, we would be determining where we are. I'm convinced of that. But for now, this is where, climate deniers, if we move away from here, we would move away from that cradle of stable temperatures in which human civilization has grown. It's a very serious issue, then I think climate deniers just miss the point.